Hello and welcome to Face to Face. Today we are doing Face to Face on the origins of the global war on terror. Our guest is Joshua Blakeney. Joshua is an MA student at the University of Lethbridge. And, well, Joshua, why don't you just tell us what happened?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on your show. It's a pleasure to be here in this fine city of Victoria. Well, basically, I came to Canada in 2005 from the UK, and by 2006, I was enrolled in education at the University of Lethbridge, pursuing a sociology degree. And come 2007, I'd walked into Professor Anthony Hall's Globalization Studies classes and found it quite an amazing pedagogical experience that he was offering the class. And fortunately, he at that time was beginning to revise his position on 9/11, splitting the sky, the Mohawk activist who attempted a citizen's arrest on George W. Bush on March 17th, 2009. He had actually been in New York on September 10th, and as a result had been quite compelled to look into 9/11, had become a 9/11 skeptic, as many do when they look into what did and did not happen on 9/11, and had kind of pressured Professor Hall to revise his position on 9/11. And luckily, because he's a serious academic, he had the humility and integrity to recognize that perhaps he'd been a bit hasty to prescribe to the tale that we were told within hours of the atrocity of 9/11, the events of 9/11.
So Professor Hall initially believed the official story of 9/11.
Yeah.
What happened to make him change?
Well, I think from his perspective, so many academics have looked into what did and did not happen on 9/11. And by 2007, there was a plethora of scholarly works like David Ray Griffin now. For example, when we're in 2011 now, Professor Griffin has written 10 books on 9/11 alone. He's at the Claremont Graduate University. In Canada, there's many academics, mainly in Ontario. Graham McQueen, who founded Peace Studies at McMaster, he's gone through all the transcripts of the testimony of the firefighters on 9/11. And like all academic subjects, we have to address specific questions. I mean, people like to generalize that we're conspiracy theorists, but in reality, academics are treating this like any other academic subfield. I mean, there's historical aspects of it. There's the study of metallurgy, there's architects and engineers, who looked into this, pilots who look into the flight paths. It's a very interdisciplinary subject, and as a result, it's a fascinating subject to pursue in an academic sense. And so Professor Hall, I think, realizing that so many of his colleagues had come to the conclusion that the official story of 9/11's implausible and false, was happy to come off the fence. He, of course, doesn't posit counter hypotheses. I mean, there tends to be this feeling that if you're going to exculpate those 19 Arabs with box cutters, that somehow one has to then come up with a whodunit hypothesis within minutes. You often get, well, if you don't believe the official story, well, who did it then? And of course, refuting one theory doesn't then give one a burden of proof to come up with a counter narrative. I was sitting having lunch with a prominent judge who I know in Toronto, and he said, "Oh, well, if you're going to say these 19 Islamists didn't do it, shouldn't you come up with another theory?" And I said, "Well, when you say not guilty in court, you don't then say to the lawyer or the defendant, oh, you must now tell me who did do the murder or something." And that's the same principle. Most people are more focused on refuting the official conspiracy theory. The fact is, the official story is a conspiracy theory, because a conspiracy, of course, is as Canadian as maple syrup. When two people or more come together to knock off a 7-Eleven store, they've engaged in a conspiracy, and it's alleged, the official story posits, that 19 Arabs with box cutters engaged in a conspiracy with their compadres ensconced in caves in Afghanistan to outfox the most elaborate and sophisticated national security system on the planet, and hijack 4 planes, flying 2 of them into the 2 buildings, but bringing down 3 if we incorporate Building 7, the 47-story skyscraper that collapsed in 6.5 seconds. One is alleged to have hit the Pentagon, which, to have done so, would have violated laws of aerodynamics and Newton's third law, that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. In other words, the plane's wings, when hitting the lamppost at 500 miles an hour, should have had the same effect as a lamppost hitting the wing of the plane at 500 miles an hour, and yet we were left with very little debris to suggest that a big Boeing 747 struck the Pentagon on that day. And of course, we're told that Flight 93 crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, although again, there's quite little evidence showing that a big aeroplane crashed there. And so as a result of a dearth of evidence, one is compelled to then investigate what might have happened. I mean, it's really a matter of truth. I mean, unfortunately, the academy is stuck in this kind of relativistic mentality, this postmodern mentality that everyone's opinion is of equal value and equally true, when it can't be. If there's a big elephant in this studio, or if there's not, is not a matter of subjective perspective. It's either there is or there isn't. Likewise, if a big 757 hit the Pentagon, I'd like to see evidence of that. And so far, having studied 9/11 intensively, I haven't seen that. And so for the official story to be true, for these so-called 19 Islamists with box cutters, even though they were clearly not Islamists because they were seen eating pork, attending strip clubs, one was dating a hooker, taking drugs and engaging in activities that were highly un-Islamic. One was even overheard blaspheming against God himself whilst he was sitting in a pub drinking vodka. These individuals, if they were Islamists, they would have then had to have suspended Newton's laws of aerodynamics, and society's laws can be violated, but laws of physics cannot. And therefore, one has to then look at the political implications of the falsity of that official story.
Okay, let's do just that. But let's start with me asking you, can you explain what you mean when you say the laws of
physics, of aerodynamics.
Physics and aerodynamics were violated. Specifically, what?
Well, as I just said, for example, for a plane, the plane coming into the Pentagon at that low level, for a start, it couldn't have actually traveled at that speed at that low level because the engines can't travel when the air is so dense at a very low altitude. The engines start actually acting as a brake. And so many pilots for 9/11 Truth, some of the US's top pilots have come out and said, actually, an airplane couldn't do this. A 757 traveling at 500 miles an hour couldn't do so at that altitude for a start. Secondly, I mean, for the maneuvers to have been pulled off by someone like Hani Hanjour, who was scaring off pilot instructors because every pilot instructor that evaluated his flying skills was scared that he was going to crash the plane. He was such a terrible pilot, even in a very small aeroplane, let alone some gigantic 757. And so for Hani Hanjour to have pulled this off, when even experienced pilots are saying this is aeronautically impossible to have, for example, done the maneuvers that big aeroplane is supposed to have done, suggests that it's a violation of laws of aerodynamics, right?
And then at the site of the crash, the supposed crash of the airplane into the Pentagon, there is no debris.
There's very little debris. I mean, within the 9/11 Truth movement, it's a contentious issue because there are some who believe a big 757 could have hit the Pentagon. Definitely a flying something hit the Pentagon. There's actually a lady named April Gallup who was in the Pentagon and has actually taken the members of the U.S. administration to court for attempted murder, I believe, against her and her small son who climbed out a hole at the back of the Pentagon. I think that this issue is obviously it's a very interdisciplinary subject, as I say, and so whereas pilots for 9/11 Truth are dealing with that specific aspect of the Pentagon, structural engineers will deal with the collapse of World Trade Center Building 7, the 47-story skyscraper that collapsed in a matter of seconds, which would be an unprecedented incident in the history. A multifaceted thing. I mean, personally, I'm in recent studies have got into these more hard science aspects of 9/11, but I focus more on like political and historical elements to do with, the history of Al-Qaeda. Who were these Al-Qaeda? Do they even exist as a coherent and autonomous non-state actor? We're told that this is a non-state actor, that 19 members of a terrorist group called Al-Qaeda pulled off not only this terrorist attack, but 7/7 in London and all these other explosions. But it seems that there's little evidence to support that. I mean, there was a parliamentarian in Japan who stood up and quite courageously, his name's Fujita, last name Fujita, the parliamentarian for Ibaraki, which is a prefecture outside Tokyo. And he stood up and said, well, how do we know how the Japanese citizens who died on 9/11 died? And the Japanese parliament's government said, well, the Americans told us, our imperial masters, they told us. And then he said, well, since when have we never investigated the murder of Japanese citizens? And do you have any evidence Al-Qaeda did this? Osama bin Laden actually denied involvement in this. Originally, he said, as a Muslim, I wouldn't have been involved in such a terrorist attack. And even CNN quoted him saying that. And so, and there's evidence that bin Laden was strapped to a dialysis machine with kidney failure rather than leading a terrorist militia from.
Now, just mention that. It was widely believed that Osama bin Laden died a long time ago. He was very ill at the time of the attacks. He was supposedly visited by the CIA. CIA operatives in the hospital. I can't remember where he was, an American hospital somewhere
in Dubai, yeah.
In Dubai. I mean,
and he was in one in Rawalpindi too, yeah.
You've made a lot of very interesting statements, and I happen to agree with just about all of them. How do you account for the interesting fact that the media of this nation, Canada, and the United States, I'm assuming Britain is the same, hopefully a little better, won't report on any of it? Because if they ever did, everybody would know that the official story is absolutely and completely impossible, filled with holes like Swiss cheese. Obviously, there's so much evidence that any one of the parts of the official story, the coming down of the buildings, the attack on the Pentagon, the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania, which there's no evidence of a plane there either, I understand.
Yeah.
Where was the Air Force? Everything. And yet the media refuses to report on any of it. So what does that mean for our society?
Well, it tells us a lot of things. Of course, in the Cold War, Senator Frank Church did the Church Committee and looked into CIA involvement in civilian society, and he uncovered that up to 3,000 journalists were working with the CIA and up to 5,000 university professors. And that was at a time when they actually had an enemy, namely the Soviet Union. They had a tangible and stable status quo at the time. And yet they had to go to such an extent to plant disinformation, for example, against the Sandinistas, to say they were a part of a Moscow conspiracy and so on. So it's really the media who are the conspiracy theorists invariably, and people like myself who are refuting a conspiracy theory can't really be accused to be conspiracy theorists, but are so. And so today, when the enemy is largely an illusion, largely a state-sponsored illusion, do you know you're more likely to die in the bathtub or from lightning than from terrorism based on US statistics? And in fact, if you go on the FBI's website, it indicates that Islamic terrorists committed 6% of terrorist attacks between 1980 and 2005. Jewish terrorists commit 7% of terrorist attacks between 1980 and 2005. And Hispanic terrorists committed 42% of terrorist attacks between 1980 and 2005. And therefore, we should either be having a war on bathtubs because they kill more people than terrorists, or if we are having a war on terrorism, Islamic terrorists are the negligible phenomenon in that context. And so
now Joshua said all of that a little bit quickly.
Yeah.
But when you think back upon what he said, he's absolutely right. We're being fed a complete line of hogwash, and being told we have to change our entire society because of it. We have to take off our clothes almost when we go to an airport. We're involved in 2 wars. Our government keeps telling us that there's a huge problem out there, and because of that problem, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but a new border is being created kind of around Canada and the United States, where the plan is, this is an agreement already signed, I believe, by Mr. Harper and Mr. Obama. The plan is to kind of get rid of the border between Canada and the United States and put a new border around our 2 countries. This is happening without probably 95% of Canadians ever even hearing about it, and it's being done because of 9/11, and yet what Joshua is saying, which I agree with completely, and so do so many others. 9/11, there has to be an honest investigation. The official story is ridiculous, and yet we keep being told it over and over and over again as if it were true, and that is just used to manipulate us.
Yeah, now there's been a counteroffensive because, of course, Jonathan Kay at the National Post, who's now written 2 books in his life, one co-authored with a Mossad agent named Michael Ross, a hagiography of the Israeli Mossad, an apologetic for the Israeli Mossad, and now one book, Among the Truthers, in which he assails vast swathes of the 9/11 skeptics community, makes grotesque generalizations about disparate theories and theorists. In an academic context, you can't generalize and say, all anthropologists are racist or all sociologists are homophobic. You have to say, well, is Josh Blakeney homophobic? And I'm clearly not. But, you have to reduce it to an individual theorist and his or her work and individual theories and break down, knowledge and argumentation. But in the case of the media, the likes of Jonathan Kay, for ideological reasons, have been attempting to conflate 9/11 skeptics under the rubric of conspiracy theorists. So they say, well, those who believe Elvis is alive, those who, and then constant invocation of the protocols of the elders of Zion, and in some way to try and discredit those of us who ask reasonable questions like how did Building 7 collapse, and try to couple us or associate us with anti-Semitism or Holocaust denial or things that we're not looking into or investigating or professing. I mean, I've never espoused an anti-Semitic thought in my life, but yet, constantly one is compared and contrasted with Holocaust deniers and even the authors of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is somewhat odd. And in fact, if you actually look at what we're saying with 9/11, we're saying that governments can do grotesque and elaborate crimes and keep it from their people, and with the collaboration of the media and academia, hide that grotesque crime from their people. So if anything, we're reinforcing the accepted narrative of the Holocaust, because that's what the government did then. They did a grotesque and elaborate crime and hid it from their people. And so if anything, it's not us who are the Holocaust deniers. And of course, when we look at what happened on 9/11, there was an attempt at first to pin it on the Palestinians. There was an attempt to blame the Popular Front for the liberation of Palestine. And indeed, there was pictures showing of Palestinians celebrating on CNN, even though that footage came from 1993 when they were celebrating a religious festival. And so what was interesting, I think, after 9/11, obviously there was probably competing cabals in the US imperial system involved in 9/11, but there was attempts to pin the tail on the donkey, as it were, portray different groups as the enemy or the people who've done this. So likewise, Saddam Hussein, there was people in the American Enterprise Institute immediately authoring arguments and journalistic pieces arguing that it was Saddam Hussein who was harboring al-Qaeda and helped to do 9/11, because of course the neoconservatives and those who are ideologically partisan to Israel, they wanted to take out Saddam and balkanize the Middle East, whereas the representatives of big oil, those who are personified like Zbigniew Brzezinski, they say, no, we need to have alliances with those in the Middle East, that like Iran, for example, because Iran's enemy was actually the Taliban, because they're Sunni, the Taliban, and Iran's Shia. So Brzezinski and the traditional US imperial establishment say, well, why don't we co-opt these Middle East dictators and strongmen and use them against our real enemies of Russia and China? Those partisan to Israel say, well, that's very, very well for you, ensconced in Texas with your oil companies in Houston and Dallas, but for those of us in the Middle East, we have to feel the wrath of those Middle East dictators who you buttress, who view Israel as a cuckoo in the nest. And so take, for example, Saddam Hussein in 1991, he fired Scud missiles at Israel, and he sponsored those in Gaza and the West Bank resisting Israeli encroachment into their territories. And so you have this contradiction in the US imperial system, which I think is a historically precedented thing. Take, for example, the global British Empire. You had the local sort of manifest destiny, we're God's chosen people elites in South Africa and in the 13 colonies too, in the 18th century, who said, we don't like taking orders from London anymore. You're doing deals with the savages, with the natives. In the case of American Declaration of Independence, we see King George did bring on the merciless Indian savages whose known means of warfare is the undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. And that's because King George had actually declared in the Royal Proclamation of 1763, we're going to do alliances with the Indians. You have kind of two schools of thought. One is to do a rapacious genocide and kill all those who are on top of the lands and resources. Another is to do treaty making. The American empire, if you actually look at the record, has traditionally attempted to do bilateral negotiations with Middle East leaders because the US wants their oil and wants the resources. And a lot of Middle Eastern leaders, as we saw in 1973 with the oil embargo, can have some sway over the American empire. And so that's why we saw, for example, George Bush Sr., George H.W. Bush, actually stand up to the Israel lobby, stand up to Israel and said, if you want our taxpayers' money still, you have to have some kind of démarche vis-a-vis the Palestinians. You can't continue this attempt to create a kind of greater Israel and this attempt to colonize the West Bank and Gaza. You have to do a treaty and negotiate with those in the Middle East. Those on the Likudnik right, starting in the 1980s, began to do what the founding fathers of the United States did. So why should we take orders from a distant capital city, a metropolis that's giving us orders? Why can't we take care of the Middle East? And so we saw the plotting and scheming for a new vision for the Middle East, one where they tried to portray Israel's paradigm and Israel's interests as being synonymous with those of the American empire, when many scholars have argued that that's not actually true. And so, take for example with Professor Walter Mearsheimer of the University of Chicago and Harvard. They've written a controversial book called The Israel Lobby, which then ignited a whole debate after they published it was an essay in the London Review of Books that evolved into a more lengthy book, a monograph, in which they actually argued that the war against Iraq had a lot more to do with Israel and Israel's imperatives and the power of AIPAC and other Israel lobby groups.
Well, who's with Israel then? I mean, there must be big money somewhere, oil money, or somebody must think that if Israel moves ahead and gets what they want, whatever that is, then we're going to benefit from it.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Traditionally in empires, you always have different schools of thought. So like in the British Empire, you had Lord Lugard who said we should rule Nigeria through indirect rule by propping up local elites. And that's been one school of thought in the American Empire. Let's rule the Middle East through indirect rule, right? We rule it through compradors, through puppets. Then there's another school of thought, which is one I'd say that has a lot of support from Israel, which is let's smash up the Middle East and destabilize the Middle East and foment ethnic sectarianism and civil war. So Israel's enemies will be fighting each other rather than the Israeli hegemon in the region. And that way Israel can break down the Middle East, the Bantustanization of the Middle East, or some say the Lebanonization of the Middle East, doing what they did in Lebanon by fomenting sectarianism in a fissiparous part of the world, rather than, allowing the Middle East to get strong, albeit under the auspices of a dictator. Now, who supports that? Well, look at who the neocons were. I mean, you have the likes of Wolfowitz and Feith, both of whom lost their security clearances in the 1980s for passing classified documents to the government of Israel. These are individuals who I would say, and others have argued, such as Professor James Petrus.
But how do people like that then, who lose their security clearances, yet still remain in government and so powerful that 20 years later, and not only them, but dozens and many dozens of others, obviously, there is this secret cabal within the government that operates completely out of sight and has the power to, if people think that they control the U.S. government, that's obviously ridiculous.
Well, it's a fascinating question, and in fact, Stephen Snigoski, who's done a lot of work on this subject, he entitles his book "The Transparent Cabal," which sounds oxymoronic, because he says yes, they were a cabal, but they actually said everything they wanted to do in their media venues, in their academic journals, in the American Enterprise Institute, and think tanks, and so on. And so, if you look at the documentary record, it's quite clear that those who are partisan to Israel, those who I would say are, the phrase Israel firsters, or people whose primary allegiance is to Israel, not to that of the US, have been saying time and time again, we need to take out Saddam Hussein, those realists, what the traditional American empire...
But they are completely protected. They're protected by the media. Who owns the media? Who owns the media in the United States? Who owns CNN? It's General Electric, it's, who owns these corporations? Because if the media chose to destroy any of these people, they could do it in a week. If the media chose to tell us the truth about 9/11, or what we see as the truth, everything would immediately turn upside down. So we have to look at the ownership and control of these corporations, because behind it all, they are the power.
Yeah, but there's a lot of people who are very angry with people like Wolf Blitzer in the United States, who used to work for AIPAC, who's one of the lead men on CNN, Jonathan Kay. You look at him, he's writing books with a former Mossad agent, and in recent weeks I've been getting attacked in Canada myself by this former Mossad agent, Michael Ross. What's a former Mossad agent doing writing in the Canadian media? That would imply that behind the scenes, the National Post for a long time was owned by an individual named Israel Asper,
Yeah, but now it's owned by the banks.
Well, it's not owned by the banks. If you actually go and trace who it's owned by, I traced it back via Wikipedia to the people who own it, and one of the people who seems to be involved with the company that put out money for the National Post, I traced as having been given an honorary award for his dedication to the state of Israel, actually. And
it's Post Media now, right?
Yeah, Post Media, but the people who put up the money is a kind of institute or an entity.
Look at the Globe and Mail. It's owned by the Thompson family. It spouts the same nonsense, just a little not so crazy as the National Post. And actually, the National Post, much as I would never buy it, there is the odd, interesting story in there, too.
Yeah, and so I think what we have to see, like with the Church Committee, where they found CIA involvement.
CFAX here in town, they spout the same stuff. And it's owned by Bell Media.
Yeah.
They're all the same,
Well, what you have to look is not who jumped on the war on terrorism's bandwagon post 9/11, who prior to 9/11 plotted and schemed and planned 9/11 and the 9/11 wars, who really had a vested interest in creating this perception of Islamic people as the other, Islamic people as extirpated from the West. I have a book in my bag outside called Terrorism, How the West Can Win, edited by Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu, the incumbent Prime Minister of Israel, in 1986, no less, the year I was born, in which they're using all the language and vocabulary of the war on terrorism that only entered our lexicons post-2001. I'm not saying that oil companies and the media and all the opportunists that we see in day-to-day life didn't jump on the bandwagon. I'm asking who created the bandwagon, who forged this plan,
well, that
who coined
goes back
the phrase.
A long time. If you look back to the 1920s, the Bush family was funding Adolf Hitler and the Nazis.
Yeah, that's true.
Using a bank that the Senator Prescott Bush controlled, and funneling money from American corporations and wealthy individuals to build up Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. And look what came out of that. I mean, who created? Where did it all start? I mean, it's like it never stops. These lunatic nutcases just have too much power, whoever they are, and we see what they're doing. I mean, just take a look around us, folks. What we see, the environmental disaster, the economic disaster, the war disaster. I mean, there's wars all over the place now, and we're involved in two of them as Canada. These people have got to be removed from power, and the only way I see of that happening is to start promoting more democracy and a free press. I think that's the kind of stuff we need.
Like we're doing now, which is a great opportunity. Well, I think one thing I found, on the left, that was a tendency to say, oh, it's the American empire, it's the military-industrial complex. These generalizations serve a function, but when you actually say, well, who were the neoconservatives? What motivated them? If there was a crime, you can't generalize and arrest a whole swathe of people. You have to say who were the individuals, what motivated them, what was the motive for the murder.
Yeah.
And, like on 9/11, 5 Mossad agents were arrested after they were seen celebrating the towers coming down. Dov Zakheim, who's a US-Israeli dual citizen working in the Pentagon, he lost $2.3 trillion under his auspices that Donald Rumsfeld then announced had been lost on September 10th, a very strategic date to plant such a news story, because the next day everything shifted onto a new subject. And so all I'm saying is it seems that, also if we want to help the Palestinian people, surely a good way to do that would be to expose Israel's most egregious crimes and blunders in order to attempt to shift public opinion against this quite immense disinformation campaign that's been going on against Arabs and Muslims. And I ask you again, who would have the motivation really to go to such an extent to demonize Arabs and Muslims? George Bush Sr., for example, is the enemy.
The same people who in Nazi Germany were demonizing the Jews. I mean,
no, not the same people. I'd say completely.
You always try to create an enemy and then use that enemy to benefit whatever it is you're trying to do.
I'd say it's a different faction. I think what we have to
different factions.
Yeah, a different faction. What happened in World War II? What happened in World War II? You had the traditional Anglo-American empire builders who were trying to buttress Hitler in order to, protect capitalism, basically. And in order to protect capitalism, they needed to demonize an other, so they demonized Jews and gypsies. And that was indeed Prescott Bush, and George Bush Sr. kind of emerged from that. George Bush Jr. is a different individual. I don't think we should conflate all the Bushes together. He jumped on that neocon bandwagon that, as I say, was created for him to jump on. It was plotted and schemed by people like Michael Ledeen, who's a credibly accused Mossad agent. A lot of people in the US are perceiving 9/11 as having been some way of the Israelis saying, we're going to take care of the Middle East, thank you very much. Professor Chomsky's largely been a failure on 9/11 and on many issues, but he coined a phrase recently, Israel feared the South Africanization of their situation. Now that would be like, the South Africans, of course, when it was expedient for the American empire to use them in the Cold War and to have them doing encroachments into Angola and into the surrounding countries in order to suppress self-determination, the US used them. But when it became inexpedient in the international arena for the US to buttress the apartheid racist regime in South Africa, they cast them adrift. Likewise, after the Cold War was over, what interest did the US have in supporting Israel anymore? Evidently, it alienates all the people who have the oil. That in the Cold War after 1967, Israel displayed some ability to crush Arab nationalism, crush any Arab resistance, and therefore it served a function for the American empire in the context of the Cold War, where you had the Soviet Union invariably sponsoring Arab nationalist causes and the Palestinian resistance. After the Cold War, Israel's fear evidently was, well, what if the US decides to just side with these Arabs? And that was exactly what Bush Sr. was displaying, that kind of amicable relationship with Israel's enemies, especially Saddam Hussein. Susan Lindau, who's a former CIA agent, she was an activist who was...
But Bush Sr. eventually went to war against Saddam Hussein.
Indeed, and then he became the enemy of the Israel lobbyist. Why? Because he receded Saddam from Kuwait. He secured Kuwait and went back to the status quo ante, and they were all saying, go on, take out Saddam, take him out. And then he said, no, because I'm an oil man. I want stability in the Middle East. I want to go back to the status quo ante of stability for oil markets. I want to play off different factions in the Middle East against each other for stability, whereas the Israelis were spitting mad with him because he wouldn't take out their number one foe, who was Saddam Hussein. And so that's where I'm trying to illuminate this contradiction. It's nothing, really ethnic about this or religious. I'm, saying it's like empire, right? This is what the US founding fathers did. They say, why are we taking orders from London?
I agree with you. I just don't see, I mean, Israel's a country of, 5 or 6 million people. It has no money.
Well, its supporters in North America have a great deal of money.
Supporters in North America, but it depends completely on USA. To be running a military like they're running, probably one of the biggest militaries in the world, you've got to have the kind of money that a country of 6 million people ain't going to have.
Can I respond to that?
Of course.
Yeah, sorry. So Naomi Klein authored a very fascinating piece in a couple of years ago called Israel's Military-Industrial Complex, and she said exactly what you're saying. In 2000, Israel's economy was at its worst state since 1954. Thanks to 9/11, Israel is one of the number one exporters of the securities industry because if they were anything, they were world experts in dealing with terrorism, right? Their securities industry, they have imports and exports with Iraq now, thanks to the balkanization of Iraq. And so this has been a revival. I'm not saying that, this was a very tight group of people who did this. The neocons were often intermarried and very, very close. So I'm not by any means saying this has got anything to do with the broader, even the Israeli population or the broader Jewish community. But there is a lot of people who are now recognizing that 9/11 had a lot to do with Israel, that the war on terrorism, a phrase coined by Netanyahu himself, had a lot to do with Israel's imperatives, Israel's geostrategic imperatives, because of course it would be pretty disastrous if the US said, well, actually, we don't have any vested interest in sponsoring you anymore. The Cold War's over, things have changed, and as Professor Chomsky says, the South Africanization of Israel would ensue. What happened to the white minority regime who was surrounded by a hostile indigenous population after they got abandoned by the US and the veto the US used to provide them became, it dissipated. Yeah. That was lost.
I think the same thing would happen to Israel as soon as
it would dissipate. But thanks to 9/11 now, we're at war with Israel's enemies, are we not? The whole world hates Israel's enemies, wears Israel's spectacles, views the world through that paradigm that was all concocted in Tel Aviv, actually.
I don't know. I mean, I don't hate Iraq. I'm Jewish and I don't hate Iraq. I've got nothing against Iran. I think the vast majority of people think the United States is the lunatic nation now.
Yeah. So,
I mean, that's the real end result of everything that's happened since 9/11. And, I mean, look what they're doing. Look what they're doing.
Well, and then the American...
And they haven't stopped doing it for 50 years, really. It's been right after the war with Germany was over, the Cold War was started.
Yeah.
In the middle of that, you had the Vietnam War. I mean, this never-ending. And this is the next step. Whatever they want this next step to be. Now it's a war against forever, against enemies that don't even really exist. We can't see them, but we have to fear them. They've made fear into a growth industry. They won't stop letting us fear. You have to be afraid. That's the new message they're promoting.
Well, as a Jewish individual, being against the Iraq war, you're with the majority of Jews because statistics shows that more than half of the Jewish population in North America were against the Iraq war. In fact, that ended up being about 70% of the Jewish population were against the invasion of Iraq. But there is a right-wing Likudnik faction. The Likud party goes back to the revisionist current of Zionism that did promote this agenda of taking out Saddam Hussein. I'm not saying that the US empire doesn't want to do war. All I'm saying is they didn't want to do war against Saddam Hussein. They didn't want to go and carve the Middle East up into a balkanized and destabilized situation. They wanted to go to Eurasia. Don't believe me, you just have to listen to Zbigniew Brzezinski or even Henry Kissinger, who himself actually denounced the invasion of Iraq.
But even, they went after Iraq under Bush Sr., the first war against Saddam Hussein
Well, they reluctantly did, and they went there, and then they receded. They pushed him back into Iraq, and they didn't invade him and take him out. If they were so intent on taking him out, why didn't they do it back then in the first Gulf War? You know why?
No idea.
The reason was because oil men, they want stability for oil markets, and as a result,
I don't remember the first war being reluctant.
In fact,
I mean, there was a lot of talk that the Americans had first told Saddam Hussein that yes, go into Kuwait.
And indeed, that's because they were supporting him, and they recognized that the relationship of Kuwait to Iraq is the same relationship Northern Ireland has to the South, to the Republic of Ireland. The Northern Ireland was carved out by Anglo-imperialists, and therefore, because the US was so supportive of Saddam, some elements within Big Oil said, well, if Saddam went and reclaimed the tiny sheikhdom of Kuwait, would it be that bad for us? At the same time as he was invading Kuwait, they were still selling him technology that he could rearm missiles with. That's how close they were were with him. And those representatives of big oil were despised by Israel, because Saddam Hussein was attacking the Israeli government. He fired Scud missiles. As I say, I've seen the monuments in Tel Aviv. And I think it's important, before we get into 9/11, to put it in the correct context, that within the US empire, like in every empire, the British Empire, the French Empire, there's different factions, different schools of thought. So the Israeli agenda, they had collaborators like Dick Cheney. Why did Dick Cheney collaborate with the Israelis? Well, because Dick Cheney works for Halliburton, or worked for Halliburton, then has a lot of shares with Halliburton. Halliburton isn't an oil company. Halliburton supports the destruction of every country, because Halliburton gets contracts to rebuild countries. So if someone nuked Alberta, that would be pretty good for Mr. Cheney and Halliburton, because they would go in and rebuild it. So I think there was a misdiagnosis of the whole invasion of Iraq, which was a prominent feature of these 9/11 wars. It was actually there not for big oil to take the oil, although they attempted to.
Just to rebuild.
But actually to destroy and destabilize, therefore making the Arabs, fomenting sectarianism and civil war, which we've seen. I mean, Iraq's largely broken down into mini statelets now, which is almost becoming like a reservation system with the Indians.
How much more can the Middle Eastern nations take before they strike back at this force that's destroying them? I mean, because now it's Iraq, it's what used to be Palestine. Libya is now under attack, Afghanistan. How much more can they take before they start to lash back? Is that what a lot of this is also about? They do want to create the war of civilizations that they've been talking of?
I think so. I think that there is definitely, Nafiz Ahmed, a professor at the University of Sussex, he wrote a book to do with 9/11, displaying 9/11 skepticism, called The War on Truth. He starts the whole narrative at the Jerusalem Conference on International Terrorism in June 1979, where you kind of had Israel proposing this war on terrorism, this war on international terrorism, and the representatives of big oil not really going along with it. And I think that, definitely after the 1973 oil embargo, where there was some unification in the Middle East, where the Arab states got together, and of course OPEC has provided that opportunity too. That was another agenda of the neocons, was to weaken OPEC, which reaps lucrative profits for these Arab leaders, right? And for which they can buy weapons, and many of the members of OPEC are Muslim countries, right? And so it's very interesting actually if we read Ezra Levant's book, right? Because what's Ezra saying? Ezra is saying we should stop doing deals with Iran, stop doing deals with Saudi Arabia, the ethical oil book, which I'm discussing, and we should promote Alberta's oil sands. And so one reason I've been quite fascinated, one question I've been quite fascinated with is, why is Stephen Harper so pro-Israel, so one-sided? I mean, some people call him the most one-sided leader on Israel in the whole world. And of course, I couldn't figure it out, because in the US, you can actually, basically buy politicians. But in Canada, the donation system's quite different, right? In Canada, you can't actually, there's a cap on what you can give in terms of donations.
Oh, don't worry, Mr. Harper. He's been corporate from 30, 40 years ago. He's been corporate right from the beginning, which is why he is the Prime Minister. So, and
then his base of support's in the Alberta oil patch. And so if this policy of smashing up the Middle East, making the Middle East not very conducive for oil production is allowed to prevail, that's very good for the Alberta tar sands, because as the Middle East oil markets get destabilized and the oil profits become less lucrative, and the ability to despoil the Middle East becomes more difficult as these, for example, in Egypt, when the Egypt revolution was happening, people were missing that there was bombs going off in the Coptic churches at the time. And the Lawyers Guild of Egypt came out and made a public statement that they thought they were Mossad false flag terrorist attacks blowing up Coptic churches in order to create sectarianism. If people Google Oded Yinon, a strategy for Israel in the 1980s, he talks about, in that paper, which was taken up by Ariel Sharon as the Israeli foreign policy, he talks about basing the new Middle East order on what the Ottoman Empire did. The Ottoman Empire ruled its empire through ethnic and religious fiefdoms, like ethno-religious statelets, in which case the whole Middle East was weak and divided. It's what they did in North America with the reservation system. And so to come back to your question of, will the Arabs be able to muster some kind of unified response? Well, that's the whole goal, is to prevent that, because Arab nationalism has been the enemy of those who want to pursue this colonial project in the Middle East. Arab nationalism, if the Arabs actually get together, if the natives get together, every colonial project has hated that concept of. It's why, for example, when we saw the American Revolution happen, we saw Tecumseh, who's really a founder of this fine country of Canada. He argued for an Indian confederacy, or he created his Indian confederacy and allied with the British in the War of 1812. That was a good example of where the natives got their act together and actually tried to resist those crazed, Bible-bashing colonists who are expanding into Indian territory. Likewise, if the new Middle East order is to be based on the Ottoman system, the Ottomization of the Middle East, as some have called it, breaking the Middle East down into these ethnic and religious statelets, that will ensure that there's never any Arab nationalism, never any unification. The Islamic Revolution in Iran is the only potential unifying force that can, galvanize people and bring people together in order to fight imperialism and colonialism, whether it's US imperialism, whether it's Israeli, this new nascent Israeli empire that I think is emerging in the Middle East, or other forms of imperialism. That seems to have been the bane of the Middle East, is every settler colonist, every colonial force have been wanting to, rape and pillage the Middle East. And it just seems that one empire declines and a new empire takes over. The British Empire was there, they declined. The American Empire got the keys to the cars. And I'm viewing 9/11 as largely being an Israeli usurpation of power. They're taking over the Middle East. There was an author named Alpheus Snow who was writing in the earliest 20th century, in about 1918, 1919. And he did a great analysis of the American Revolution and said, well, these guys weren't caring about Enlightenment principles. They were land speculators who wanted to take over the lands west of the Ohio Valley that the British Crown had reserved for them. And he coined a phrase, a Latin phrase, imperium in imperio. The American secessionists, some of them were okay to stay within the framework of the British Empire, but they wanted a mini empire to take care of North America, an imperium in imperio. And likewise, I think the state of Israel is now forming an imperium in imperio, like, we'll take care of the Middle East, thank you very much. We're not having you guys propping up our enemies anymore. And I think that when you read the statements and hear the statements of Zbigniew Brzezinski, these kind of big American empire builders, they say, well, no, Russia and China are our enemy. We should be using Iran, building up Iran to fight our real enemies who are Russia and China.
Brzezinski and Kissinger are just as crazy as everybody else.
Yes, but I think it's important to not misdiagnose the problem. And if you went to the doctor and you had cancer and he told you that you actually had AIDS, you wouldn't want to misdiagnose the problem. And I think when we come to analysing 9/11 and the 9/11 wars, and especially coming to find out who killed 24 Canadians on 9/11, who exactly it was, who the individuals were, we can't use generalizations, it's the military-industrial complex, it's the permanent war economy, as if this is kind of inevitable. We should stop a minute and think, who did this? Who were the individuals who plotted and schemed for this, and what motivated them? And I think that's the best way to lead ahead with a Canadian investigation into the massacre of our citizens, those who've died in the 9/11 wars. And moreover, if you believe the statistics of Gideon Polya of the Australian National University, he suggests that 4.5 million Afghanis extra would be alive today had the invasion of Afghanistan not happened, and 2.3 million Iraqis would be alive had the invasion of Iraq not happened. And that's a big pool of blood that someone has to take responsibility for. We can't just use generalizations like, it's the same people who did the Nazis. I mean, to some extent, I agree with you that there's definitely that Anglo-American banking establishment that propped up and sponsored Hitler and helped him to protect capitalism and his anti-communist kind of machinery. The US just kind of took that over after the Cold War, right? I mean, they allowed all the Nazi doctors to come in under Operation Paperclip. And, I just think it's important that we, diagnose this properly by identifying the two schools of thought in the American empire. One is destabilize the Middle East, smash up the Middle East. And then there's one saying work with the Middle East leaders against our real enemies, Russia and China. I think that distinction is something that people can benefit from understanding rather than being, caught in generalizations all the time. That's just my point of view.
So where do we go from here?
Well, George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, in Canada we have the Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act. And it seems that the government doesn't want to uphold the rule of law in Canada. In Canada we have quite explicit laws pertaining to those who've engaged in crimes against humanity and war crimes. Self-confessed torturers now, in the case of Bush, on March 17th, 2009, splitting the sky, my close friend, he attempted a citizen's arrest on George Bush. George Bush, his first speaking engagement after losing diplomatic immunity was in Calgary, Alberta. I think he thought it was kind of a safe haven with his fellow oil lobby who are up there. And it was a test case, and the Canadian government failed to implement the law consistently. They're happy to use their crimes against humanity and war crimes legislation, which was only passed in 2000, to prosecute African people like Desire Munyaneza, who was convicted of his complicity in the Rwandan genocide, or even Guatemalan people. They rounded up a chap in Lethbridge the other day who's Guatemalan. They were happy to persecute and prosecute people who are from third world countries who've been complicit in crimes against humanity. But when it comes to the emperors rather than the middle managers in the empire, they apply the law in an inconsistent way, which means that Canada doesn't really have the rule of law. And so Lawyers Against the War and other professors, Professor Hall, my MA supervisor, have been attempting to just ask the government to apply the law consistently. It's not the case that with, like Martin Luther King, he said, well, this law is racist, and so we're doing civil disobedience, we're disobeying an unjust law. In our case, we like the law in Canada. We actually have some pretty good laws. The Immigration and Refugee Protection Act also stipulates that if you've had any involvement in war crimes, you're not welcome in this country. And so it's quite a conservative thing to say, like, could you uphold the rule of law, please, law enforcement system, or don't purport that we have a rule of law in this country, thank you very much. And so that's really the what's happening. And so we have George Bush coming back in a couple of days from now. From the timing of this interview, George Bush will be coming to Surrey, BC, to participate in an economic summit with William Clinton. Dick Cheney was here a couple of weeks ago, and it seems that these individuals are allowed to enter and exit Canada with impunity to collect lucrative paychecks, and that means that the subsequent leaders of the United States, of Israel, of Britain, of countries that repeatedly commit crimes against humanity, they'll look at the impunity that's being afforded to such individuals and say, well, look, we can get away with this. We can continue. Obama's continuing the 9/11 wars because he knows he can get away with it. He knows that Canada won't arrest him if he comes here. Having said that, George Bush was deterred from visiting Switzerland. He was told, he cancelled his trip to Switzerland after it only took one politician, I think, who came out and said, you're not welcome in our country. In fact, Don Davies, the immigration minister for the NDP, has himself said that, Richard Cheney and George Bush should be barred from Canada. So we've even seen an opposition leader in Canada now draw attention to the laws as it pertains to these individuals. And that puts, the Minister of Immigration, the incumbent minister, Jason Kenney, in an awkward position of seemingly allowing the law to be flouted or those in the law enforcement system allowing the law to be flouted for ideological and political reasons. A country that's a democratic can't have political intervention in the law enforcement system. In London, they actually managed to get a judge to issue an arrest warrant for Tzipi Livni, the Israeli foreign minister, because she's obviously confessed to the heinous crimes in Gaza in 2008, 2009. She was actually deterred from visiting Britain as a result. Now Britain have changed the universal jurisdiction laws and said that if a judge wants to issue an arrest warrant for a credibly accused war criminal, they have to, vet it through this new, appointee. I would call him the Minister of Impunity, perhaps, who has to, read the case. And basically, there's political intervention in the law enforcement system now. Judges aren't autonomous on that question, which is an indication of a breakdown of the rule of law in Britain. In Canada, it would almost be nice if they did that, so at least we'd know that, yes, we have political intervention we don't have a rule of law in Canada, but it seems that they aren't doing that. They haven't revised the law. The law is quite explicit if you've had any involvement. In the case of Bush and Cheney, they're both confessed to signing off on torture in their recent memoirs. In Bush's case, his new memoir, Decision Points, he confesses to signing off on torture. And even Amnesty International came out last week and said that Canada is obliged under international law and indeed domestic law to apprehend these individuals if they're on Canadian soil, which has upped the ante considerably because a lot of people respect Amnesty International. It's one thing for Josh Blakeney to say George Bush should be arrested. It's another thing for Amnesty International to say it. And so this is putting a lot of pressure on the Minister of Immigration, who, of course, we saw barred George Galloway a couple of weeks after he allowed George Bush into Canada. So he barred the wrong George and allowed the wrong George into Canada, it seems.
And this whole story has been quite downplayed in Canada. I mean, it's not a big issue in the media. It's barely mentioned. It did show up as the number one story on Yahoo News a couple of days ago. But basically, I think most Canadians are just sliding by like so much else does because it's downplayed. And yet it's not a joke. I mean, this is a serious matter. Under United Nations law and under Canadian law, if someone like George Bush or Dick Cheney visits Canada, a confessed torturer, we are obligated to, I don't know what we're obligated to do, detain, investigate.
Well, the Immigration and Refugee Act stipulates that if he tries to enter Canada, he should be barred. But then if he sets foot into Canada, if there's some failure in procedure, then he must be apprehended. And, I don't want him tortured. I don't want George Bush tortured. I want him to have his day in court, to have the best lawyers possible. And I want to hear his defense on matters. In the case of Dick Cheney, especially, I would have liked to have heard what he had to say about his behavior on 9/11, where he was in a bunker and someone came in and said, Mr. Cheney, the plane is 60 miles out. Mr. Cheney, the plane's 50 miles out, 30 miles out. Does the order still stand? And Cheney turned around and winced and said, yes, of course the orders still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary? I'd like that to be seen in a court of law. We have very competent judges in Canada. We have a good judiciary. It just seems that there's something blocking the implementation of the law in Canada, which seems to be quite an upsetting thing for those of us who are actually pleased that our Canadian Parliament enshrined this law. And so I think, again, the media is in a position where if the genie was let out the bottle and one individual was arrested, from the United States or Britain or France or Israel, was arrested for their crimes against humanity and war crimes, then every other one that would set a precedent, right? Every other one that came to Canada would then have to be arrested, and it would spiral into a situation where all the crooks and all the organized gangsters would be getting rounded up, which would be good for us, the people, those of us in the working class. It would be a good thing, but it seems for those in power, they don't like that, especially when really, if it's the case that 4.5 million Afghanis have died and the Canadian government have been participating in that genocide, then they're complicit too. And so we have our own leaders who would presumably not want the law to be enforced, because if they enforce it on George Bush, next time they go to the US, it might be enforced on them.
In fact, because of what happened with the Afghan detainees, we're in a position where we should be investigating Mr. Harper at this point in time. There was a column in the Toronto Star, I guess a couple of years ago, that certainly laid the groundwork for the case that Mr. Harper, possibly the Minister of Defense, Mr. McKay, and others in the government are guilty of war crimes, at least to the point where an investigation has got to be made because of the whole Afghan detainee torture incident. And yet that's been completely downplayed. Nobody in Canada knows anything about it. Nobody will talk about it. The media won't talk about it. The politicians won't talk about it. They all know about it, but they won't tell the Canadian people because it's another one of these crazy secrets. It's how far away we are from anything resembling a democratic, free nation. And we've got to get that back.
Yeah. Well, that's the situation that we're in. I mean, the war on terror, it's largely been about, the globalization of lawlessness. In fact, Philippe Sands, who's an international jurist, international law professor in London, his book is entitled The Lawless World, which I think pretty much encapsulates the post-9/11 ethos, where, emperors and our political leaders have impunity, can get away with the most heinous of crimes. And when we talk about like Omar Khadr, it's child soldiers that we're talking about. This is, there's laws that stipulate. So I saw Ezra Levant, fulminating about the possibility that Omar Khadr could be allowed back into Canada. And he was saying, well, in Afghanistan, you're an adult culturally by the age of 15 and 16 and getting married. But that's not how the law works. If the law says you're an adult at 18, it doesn't matter what one's culture says. The fact is that, international law says you're 18, you're an adult, then
Omar Khadr is the young man who is still in jail in Guantanamo.
Yeah.
Young Canadian. Nobody knows what happened because there's no evidence.
No, I mean, this is the point, because they didn't do 9/11. I mean, they've been rounded up. And
yeah.
Well, just while we're on the subject of Omar Khadr, I think the point of Guantanamo Bay was because they couldn't be tried in a court because they didn't do 9/11, because Al-Qaeda didn't do 9/11. There had to be this, this setup in Guantanamo Bay where we were told they were too dangerous to be on US soil. But in reality, it was because if they're actually put through a court of law, then there wasn't really much of a case against them. As I say, those who were seen who are the alleged hijackers were seen doing quite un-Islamic activity, implying that they weren't crazed Islamist jihadis, they were something else. And so as a result, evidently this period that we're living in is one where governments are reluctant to do any investigation into the events of 9/11. And this has implications for us as citizens, which is why we have to mobilize and disseminate the information that we have. I was just on a radio station at University of Victoria, and I was saying, how do the history professors, if you take a US history class, you get to the class on 9/11, is your professor just going to say, just parrot the official story of 9/11, or are they going to feel any responsibility to, base their views on the up-to-date scholarship? I mean, the fact is that it's understandable that, not all professors can dedicate the time to look into the minutiae of what happened on 9/11, but if they're going to invoke 9/11 in their class, I think they owe it to their students, to their readers of their scholarship, to define what they mean by 9/11, and if I was a student in such a professor's class, I'd put up my hand and say, excuse me, professor, which narrative of 9/11 do you prescribe to? There's official conspiracy theory, there's competing theories, there's an academic debate on this subject. David Ray Griffin's written 10 books. Have you read them, professor? I think that's a legitimate thing to ask. And if there is the case of just basing it on what Fox News told them or what CNN told them, that's not really a scholarly approach. And so in my MA thesis, I'm hoping to promote the idea that there's an academic debate on this subject, that we should be reasonable about this subject, that it's a legitimate academic line of inquiry, like what happened on 9/11. What did and did not happen on 9/11. It seems a reason, if one was to investigate the origins of the Napoleonic Wars or the origins of World War II, that wouldn't be controversial. But it seems when you study the origins of the global war on terror, it suddenly takes on this hysterical controversy. In the case of the National Post attacking me after I received the Queen Elizabeth II graduate scholarship to study the origins of the global war on terror, Jonathan Kay at the National Post whipped up this controversy, called on the taxpayers of Alberta to recognize this gross injustice that I was being funded to study so-called conspiracy theories. But as I established earlier in this interview, it seems that in order to talk about 9/11, you have to be willing to talk about conspiracy theories, because the official story of 9/11 is a paradigmatic conspiracy theory. And as a result, I'm obliged to recognize that, and I think it's a legitimate academic subfield to pursue.
You said that maybe it's time for change, and there is a new movement seemingly raising its head called the Occupy movement. How do you think that fits into everything in 1 minute, because we are almost out of time?
Well, I had a thrilling weekend at Occupy Vancouver. I spoke to an audience of as many as 4,000 individuals, and I think it's very important, the debates that are happening in the different groups to do with what issues really matter to us. There's people whose issue is food or the environment or anti-war causes or pro-Palestinian causes. There's a great mixture of ideas that are, being exchanged in venues such as the Occupy Vancouver movement that I've just spent the weekend, where, as I say, quite an eclectic group of people have come together in order to share ideas. And I think it's a potential powder keg for those in power. I would be quite fearful, because they love it when we're individualized into our small boxes. But when we get together and exchange ideas and get to know one another, that's the potentially revolutionary act in itself, is it not?
Well, I think it is time for revolutionary acts. Thank you very much, Joshua Blakeney, and thank you for watching Face to Face.